We discussed bonds, and now let's talk about payment methods for federal awards. State agency payments. Cash Management Improvement Act, CMIA, was enacted to ensure greater efficiency, effectiveness, and equity in the exchange of funds between the federal government and the states and territories in DC. Payments are governed by Treasury State CMIA agreements, see 31 CFR Part 205. Advance payments made by the federal awarding agency or pass-through entity according to a predetermined payment schedule. They must be limited to the minimum amounts needed and must be timed to meet actual immediate cash requirements of the approved program or project. See 31 CFR Part 208, Management of Federal Agency Disbursements. Reimbursements may be used when advance payments cannot be made, or when the federal agency sets a specific condition, or when the non-federal entity requests payment by reimbursement. The federal agency or pass-through entity must make payment within 30 calendar days of billing unless it's considered an improper request. A working capital advance happens if the recipient cannot demonstrate written processes and an adequate financial management system. In this case, the federal awarding agency or pass-through entity advances cash payments to the recipient to cover its estimated disbursement needs for an initial period geared to the non-federal entity's disbursing cycle. The Electronic Funds Transfer Act of 1978 talks about and requires requesters, the non-federal entities, to arrange pre-authorization to submit requests for advance payments and reimbursements at least monthly when EFT is not used, or as often as desired when electronic payments are used. Withholding payment means it mandates that reimbursement should not be withheld unless found in noncompliance or in delinquent to a debt to the U.S. Interest income means that a recipient can retain up to $500 in earned interest to reimburse administrative expenses. Interest-bearing accounts from federal advance payments for departments using the HHS PMS system. When talking about avoiding improper payments, there are three acts involved, largely four acts. The Improper Payments Information Act of 2002 established an initial framework for identifying, measuring, preventing, and reporting on improper payments at federal agencies. The Recovery Audits Act was passed by Congress in 2002, and it required agencies that award more than $500 million annually in contracts to establish programs to recover overpayments to contractors. The IPERA, which was the Improper Payments Elimination and Recovery Act of 2010, it consolidated the IPIA and the Recovery Audits Act. Later, the Improper Payments Elimination and Recovery Improvement Act of 2012 required agencies to share data regarding recipient eligibility and payment amounts. Types of improper payments include the following: incorrect amounts paid to eligible recipients, payments made to ineligible recipients, payments for goods and services not received, payments duplicated, payments for which insufficient or no documentation was found. Sound cash management involves, for reimbursement grants, excess cash drawn down by the recipient becomes an improper payment if money disbursed exceeds the need. Sound cash management practices include coordinating the timing of drawdowns with prior internal clearances, monitoring grant drawdowns continuously, planning for cash flow during the budget period, and reviewing cash requirements beforehand, as well as paying out grant funds for project activities as soon as it is practical to do so. What are the root causes for improper payments? Flawed program design or structure, inability to authenticate eligibility, failure to verify data, administrative or process errors, insufficient criteria for medical necessity, or insufficient documentation to determine the accuracy of a payment. Improper, improper benefits derived from excess cash on hand. In 2 CFR 200-306, it talks about cost sharing or matching. Cost sharing or matching involves the portion of project costs that are not paid by federal funds. Contributions must meet the criteria stated in 2 CFR 306, including being verifiable via documentation, not included for any other federal award, necessary and reasonable for accomplishment of project objectives, and allowable under Subpart E cost principles, and not paid by the federal government except under special circumstances, as well as being provided for in the approved budget when required by the sponsoring agency. The recipient share talks about the total recipient share required. It represents the amount of recipient funds, including all cost sharing and matching on the approved budget. The recipient share of expenditures means the amount of actual cash disbursements or outlays, less rebates, refunds, or other credits. The remaining recipient share is the difference between the total recipient share required and the recipient share of expenditures. 2 CFR 200-307 describes program income. Program income is defined as gross income earned by the non-federal entity, directly generated by a supported activity or earned as a result of the federal award during the period of performance. It includes income from fees for services, use or rental of real or personal property, sale of commodities or items fabricated under a federal award, license fees and royalties on patents and copyrights, principal and interest on loans made with federal funds. It has to be reported in accordance with one of two methods: the deductive method, which means fees that are collected in advance to reduce the costs of delivering services, or the additive method, which extends the purpose of the award by the sum of the program income. For non-federal entities other than schools, the deductive method is used. For institutions of higher education or nonprofit research institutions, the additive method is used. Some definitions include total federal program income earned, which is the amount of program income earned in excess of what it cost the recipient to generate the income. Program income expended in accordance with the deductive alternative is the amount used to reduce the federal share of total project costs. Program income expended in accordance with the additive alternative is the amount first added to the original award amount, then reported as expended to further eligible project activities. Unexpended program income is the total federal program income earned, less expended as of the reporting end date. In 2 CFR 200-308, it talks about revision of budget and program plans. Recipients must request and document prior approvals from federal awarding agencies for any of the following items: a change in the project's scope or objective, even if there are no budget changes; changes in key personnel, such as the project director; disengagement of the project for more than 3 months; a 25% reduction in time by the approved project director or principal investigator; transferring participant support costs to other categories; planning to subaward or subcontract work that was not in the original program; changes to cost sharing or matching provided by the non-federal entity, or if additional funds are needed to complete the project. Prior approvals are needed from federal awarding agencies before making certain program or budget related changes. This is found in 2 CFR 407, 2 CFR 200 407 prior written approval. Pre-award costs can be authorized by the federal awarding agency up to 90 calendar days before the award to the extent that they are allowable. See 2 CFR 200 458 pre-award costs. Recipients should recipients should retain documentation and expends at its own risk. They expends money at its own risk if they take pre-award costs. And they may not be reimbursed if the federal award is less than anticipated or inadequate to cover the costs. Modifications to the period of performance are described in 2 CFR 309. If a federal awarding agency or pass-through entity approves an extension, or if a recipient extends under 200 308, which is for the revision of budget and program plans, the period of performance will be amended to end at the completion of the extension. If a termination occurs, the period of performance will be amended to end upon the effective date of termination. If a renewal award is issued, a distinct period of performance will begin. 2 CFR 200 310 covers insurance coverage. The non-federal entity must, at a minimum, provide the equivalent insurance coverage for real property and equipment acquired or improved with federal funds as provided to property owned by the non-federal entity. Federally owned property need not be insured unless required by the terms and conditions of the federal award. Real property is described in 2 CFR 200 311. There are three terms involved: title, which is the real property acquired or improved under a federal award that will vest upon acquisition in the non-federal entity. The use involves real property that will be used for the originally authorized purpose as long as needed for that purpose, during which time the non-federal entity must not dispose of or encumber its title or other interests. And disposition, which is when real property is no longer needed for the originally authorized purpose. The non-federal entity must obtain disposition instructions from the federal awarding agency or pass-through entity. Disposition instructions from the federal awarding agency or pass-through entity must provide for one of the following alternatives: retain title after compensating the federal awarding agency, sell the property and compensate the federal awarding agency, or transfer title to the federal awarding agency or to a third party designated or approved by the federal awarding agency. 2 CFR 200 312 talks about federally owned and exempt property. Title to federally owned property remains vested in the federal government. The non-federal entity must submit annually an inventory listing of federally owned property in its custody to the federal awarding agency. If the federal awarding agency has no further need for the property, it must declare the property excess and report it for disposal to the appropriate federal disposal authority. Exempt property means property acquired under a federal award where the federal awarding agency has chosen to vest title to the property to the non-federal entity without further responsibility to the federal government. Equipment is discussed in 2 CFR 200 313. Property records must be maintained that include the description of the property, the serial number or other ID, source of funding, including the federal award identification number, the FAIN, who holds the title, the acquisition date, the cost of the property, percentage of federal participation in the project cost, the location, use, and condition of the property, and ultimate disposition data, including date of disposal and sale price of the property. Control of the equipment is talking about control systems that must be developed to ensure adequate safeguards to prevent loss, damage, or theft of the property. Adequate maintenance procedures must be developed to keep the property in good condition. If authorized or required to sell the property, Proper sales procedures must be established to ensure the highest possible return. Disposal of property is defined with the following terms. Disposition, which is the transfer or parting with various types of property that were acquired for an award project or program, but are no longer needed under the terms of the award. Items under $5,000 or 5K fair market value can be retained, sold, or disposed without federal agency involvement. Items that are 5K and above may be retained, sold, or disposed of. The non-federal entity can retain selling and handling expenses. The non-federal entity can transfer title of the property to the federal government or eligible third party. Equipment that's purchased under federal awards uses the exception in the Federal Grant and Cooperative Agreement Act. Exempts equipment from any further obligations upon the recipient post-award. Authority to vest title in tangible personal property for research, which is found in 31 USC, the United States Code, section 6306. When equipment is no longer needed, it must declare the property excess and report it for disposal to the appropriate federal authority. Supplies is discussed in 2 CFR 314. It is defined as all tangible personal property other than those described in 2 CFR 200-313 under equipment. A computing device is a supply if it costs less than the capital equipment cost of $5,000, which is defined in 2 CFR 294 under the definition for supplies. Computing devices are classified as supplies that may be used to gather, analyze, print, share, receive, or store electronic information, including small accessories under the definition. Disposal of supplies talks about the title to supplies will vest in the non-federal entity upon acquisition. If there's a residual inventory of unused supplies exceeding $5,000 in total aggregate value upon completion or termination of the project, the non-federal entity must retain the supplies for use on other activities or sell them. The federal government must be compensated for its share in the same manner as computed for equipment. 2 CFR 200-315 talks about intangible property. The title vests in the non-federal entity at the time of acquisition. The non-federal entity must use that property for the originally authorized purpose and must not encumber the property without approval of the federal awarding agency. The non-federal entity may copyright any work that was developed or for which ownership was acquired under a federal award. The non-federal entity is subject to applicable regulations governing patents and inventions. This is found under 37 CFR Part 401. The federal government has the right to obtain, reproduce, publish, and use its data. Invention statements. The Bayh-Dole Act, or the Patent and Trademark Law Amendments Act, deals with disposition of intellectual property arising from federally funded research. It permits a university, a small business, or a nonprofit institution to pursue ownership of an invention in preference to the government. The work must be disclosed to the federal awarding agencies under HHS 568, Final Invention Statement, or under NIH ERA Commons. It must submit within 90 calendar days after completion or termination of the award. I'll stop here and resume shortly.